Hope you enjoy your wedding. Without us. My phone lit up with that message an hour before I walked down the aisle. Then the room went quiet, because everyone else had already chosen where they were going. Not my wedding. My sister's baby shower. 42 chairs were set outside in that garden. Only 7 were filled. I stood there holding my bouquet, with no father beside me. And that's when a man I barely knew stepped forward, and said something that changed everything. They thought they had chosen the right side that day. They were wrong, because what they didn't know was who my husband really was. But that part of the story didn't start there. It started long before anyone realized they had made a mistake. You can tell a lot about a family by what they celebrate, and what they quietly ignore. In mine, success had a very specific look. It came with a luxury SUV in the driveway, a country club membership, and a last name that opened doors before you even knocked. It wore polished shoes, carried a platinum card, and never once had to explain itself. If you had that, you were respected. If you didn't, you were tolerated. My sister Jennifer had that. I didn't. Jennifer married Scott Parker 5 years ago. His family owned a commercial real estate company in Fairfield County, the kind of business that builds glass office towers and puts their name on the front in brushed steel. At the time, Scott was doing very well. He bought Jennifer a Lexus SUV before their first anniversary, surprised her with a Cartier bracelet on her birthday, and started helping out my parents in ways that didn't feel like help so much as control dressed up as generosity. He covered their $3,200 monthly mortgage, gave my mom a credit card for groceries and extras, paid for a full kitchen renovation, granite counters, custom cabinets, the kind of upgrades that make a house feel more expensive than it really is. And just like that, everything in our family started orbiting around Jennifer. My father, Thomas, had spent over 30 years as a branch manager at a regional bank in Hartford. He believed in structure, in discipline, in showing up every day and doing things the right way. My mother, Linda, kept the house in Glastonbury looking like it belonged in a magazine, white colonial, black shutters, hydrangeas lining the walkway in perfect symmetry. From the outside, we looked like stability. Inside, we ran on a different currency. Gratitude, obligation, quiet trade-offs no one ever said out loud. Jennifer didn't work. Not in any traditional sense. She called herself an event planner, sometimes a social coordinator, depending on who was asking. But I never saw invoices, never heard about clients, never saw anything that resembled a real schedule. It didn't matter. In our family, marrying well counted more than working hard. And Jennifer had married very well. Then there was me. I was the younger sister, the one who moved out early, who didn't follow the expected path, who didn't come back with a husband in a tailored suit and a business plan attached to his name. I was an illustrator. I painted children's books, did editorial work when it came in, and lived in a rented studio in New Haven where the countertops were permanently stained with paint no amount of scrubbing could fix. Some months were steady. Some months I stretched groceries and hoped the next check would come before the rent was due. To my family, that wasn't a career. It was a phase, the kind you grow out of if you're smart enough, or marry well enough. I never resented Jennifer for her life. What I resented was how easily her life erased mine. At family dinners, conversations bent toward her without anyone noticing. Her plans, her home, her husband's business, her next trip. Even the way my parents listened to her was different, leaning in, attentive, invested. When I spoke, it felt like background noise, not unwelcome, just unnecessary. I met Daniel Carter 3 years ago at an art fair in New Haven. He was standing in front of one of his own paintings, a large oil piece of a woman sitting on a fire escape, late afternoon light catching in her hair, and he was frowning at it like it had personally disappointed him. I laughed before I could stop myself. He turned, and there was something in his expression, not arrogance, not insecurity, just this quiet, focused intensity that made me pause, like he was always seeing something just a little deeper than everyone else. Daniel is a painter, not the kind my parents would recognize, not the kind with gallery openings and champagne receptions every other week. He worked in oils, portraits, cityscapes, pieces that took weeks, sometimes months, to finish. He sold through small galleries, took commissions when they came, and lived in the same uncertain rhythm I did. We weren't building anything flashy. We were building something real. That mattered to me. It did not matter to my family. The The first time I brought Daniel to Thanksgiving dinner, I knew exactly how it was going to go. I just didn't realize how obvious it would feel. Jennifer arrived late, carrying 2 bottles of Napa Valley Cabernet. She made sure to mention they were $200 each. My mother took them with both hands, like they were something sacred, and placed them carefully in the center of the table. I had brought a pie. I'd spent 2 hours baking it from scratch that morning. It stayed in the kitchen. Dinner went the way it always did. Conversation circled around Jennifer and Scott, their plans, their updates, their lives. Daniel sat beside me, quiet, observant, his hand occasionally brushing mine under the table. Then my father leaned forward. He had this way of smiling that looked polite until you listened closely to what came after it. "So, Daniel," he said, "when are you planning to get a real job?" Scott chuckled softly from across the table. Jennifer tilted her head, offering that familiar expression, half sympathy, half judgment. "At least Claire has someone," she added, like she was trying to be kind. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't defend himself, didn't explain, didn't try to impress anyone in that room. He just reached under the table and squeezed my hand. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. It wasn't just that my family didn't understand my life. It was that they had already decided it didn't count. And once you see that clearly, everything that follows stops feeling surprising and starts feeling inevitable. When Daniel proposed, it wasn't dramatic. No spotlight, no audience, no expensive ring pulled from a velvet box in a crowded restaurant. We were lying on the studio floor in New Haven, the old radiator clicking in the corner, snow collecting softly against the windows. There were half-finished canvases leaning against the walls, the smell of turpentine still in the air. He just turned his head toward me and said, "We could keep doing this, but together. For real." That was it. No performance, no spectacle, just truth. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We picked June 14th, a small garden venue near Mystic, Connecticut. 42 chairs, wildflowers instead of centerpieces, an arch Daniel said he could build himself out of reclaimed wood. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to be. It was ours. When I called my parents, I thought maybe this would be different. Maybe this was the kind of moment that reset things, that reminded them I wasn't just an afterthought in their lives. My father's first response wasn't congratulations. June 14th. Let me check. Not, "I'm happy for you." Not, "Tell me everything." "Let me check." He called back 2 days later, said he'd be there, said he'd walk me down the aisle. I held on to that promise longer than I should have, like it was something solid, like it meant more than just words spoken in the right tone. My mother asked how much it was costing. Jennifer sent a text. "Congrats. Let me know if you need anything." Then silence. No follow-up, no interest, no questions. Looking back, I think part of me already knew something was off. Jennifer never stayed quiet about anything. She had opinions about restaurants she'd never been to, vacations she wasn't invited on, weddings that weren't hers. The fact that she had nothing to say about mine should have told me everything. But I ignored it. Because sometimes, you don't ignore red flags because you don't see them. You ignore them because you want to believe this time will be different. 3 weeks before the wedding, I got a call from my Aunt Susan. She didn't ease into it. "Honey, are you going to Jennifer's shower too? Or just the wedding?" I remember standing in the kitchen, holding a paintbrush, a drop of turquoise falling onto the floor between my feet. "What shower?" There was a pause. "The baby shower. June 14th. At the country club in Greenwich. Same day. Same hour." I didn't even need to ask the next question. My body already knew the answer before my mind caught up. I called Jennifer. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice bright, effortless, like we were discussing brunch plans. "Oh my God, Claire, I meant to tell you. The venue Scott booked only had June 14th available. It's been a whole thing with the caterer and rentals. I can't move it now." She said it like it had just happened to her. Like weather. "But your ceremony is in the afternoon, right?" she added. "People could probably do both." My wedding was at 3 p.m. in Mystic. Her shower was at noon in Greenwich. That's a 90-minute drive without traffic. In June. On a Saturday. No one was doing both. She knew that. I knew that. There are moments in life when the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in, slow and heavy, like something sinking. That was one of those moments. I asked one question. "When did you send out the invitations?" Another pause, shorter this time. A couple weeks ago, I think. I hung up and called Aunt Susan back. She sent them 2 weeks before your save the dates went out, she said, not even lowering her voice. I assumed you two had coordinated. Coordinated. That word stayed with me. Because suddenly, this didn't feel like bad timing. It felt like a decision. I called my mother next. Mom, you know my wedding is that day. I know, honey, she said, already sounding tired. But Jennifer really needs the family there. It's her first baby. That's important. So is my wedding. Yes, of course it is, she said quickly. But weddings can be rescheduled. This is different. Different. I had already paid deposits, signed contracts, sent invitations, built something real with my own hands and time and money. And in her mind, it was still the flexible event, the optional one. I called my father. He didn't answer. I texted him. Are you still walking me down the aisle? He read it. I saw the indicator. No response. 3 days later, he finally picked up. Of course I am, he said. But there was something missing in his voice. Something hollow. Like he was repeating a line he wasn't sure he believed anymore. That week, the RSVPs started coming in. Out of 38 family members invited, 22 declined. Every single one of them coincidentally had plans in Greenwich that afternoon. I didn't call them back. I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince anyone. I asked once, and their answers, spoken and unspoken, told me exactly where I stood. Melissa was the one who showed me the part I couldn't see. She still had access to my family's group chat. My mother had added her years ago and never thought to remove her. Melissa doesn't miss details. She came over one night, sat down across from me in the studio, and placed her phone on the table like evidence. Jennifer hadn't just sent invitations. She had made calls, individual ones, to my mother. If you don't come, it'll feel like you don't care about your first grandchild. To my aunt, Scott's family will all be there. It'll look bad if ours isn't. And to my father? She didn't call. She wrote it. Claire will understand. She's used to being disappointed. I read that message twice. Then I handed the phone back. There are things people say in anger. And then there are things they say calmly, deliberately, when they believe them. That message wasn't emotional. It was accurate. At least, accurate in the version of me they had all agreed on. The one who adjusts. The one who accepts less. The one who stays quiet so everyone else can stay comfortable. Melissa watched me carefully. You don't have to be that version anymore, she said. I nodded. But the truth is, something in me had already shifted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. That night, I sent one final message to my family. No guilt. No emotion. No pleading. Just the date, the time, the address, and one line at the end. I hope to see you there. I pressed send and waited. Nothing came back. Not a single response. That silence should have told me everything. But there's a difference between understanding something and feeling it land. June 14th arrived anyway. At 7 a.m., the morning felt deceptively normal. The kind of quiet that makes you think maybe the day will soften, maybe something will change at the last minute. Melissa was sitting cross-legged on the bathroom counter in our small studio, applying my makeup with the same steady focus she used in the ER. Hospital-grade precision, she called it. I watched her in the mirror, trying to breathe like this was just another morning. My dress hung behind me on the closet door, vintage lace, ivory, tea-length. I'd found it in a consignment shop in Mystic for $120. The seamstress had charged me $80 to alter it and told me I looked like Grace Kelly. I held on to that more than I probably should have. My bouquet, white peonies and lavender, sat in a mason jar on the kitchen table. The room smelled soft, calm, like nothing had gone wrong yet. Then my phone rang. Dad. I answered before it could go to voicemail. Claire, honey. His voice sounded thinner than usual, like it had been worn down overnight. I don't know how to say this. Melissa stopped moving behind me. I saw her eyes lift in the mirror. Jennifer's shower starts at noon, he continued. And with the drive, I don't think we can make it to Mystic by 3. I didn't speak. 8 seconds. I counted them. 8 seconds where everything I had been holding together, every small justification, every quiet hope collapsed inward. You promised, I said finally. I know, he replied quickly. And I'm sorry, but this is Jennifer's first baby. You'll have other moments. Other moments. My voice didn't shake. That's the part I'm still proud of. This is my only wedding day, Dad. There was a pause. Not long, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I ended the call. Not dramatically. Not angrily. I just pressed the screen and set the phone face down on the counter. Melissa didn't say anything. She reached for the mascara wand and kept going, like if she stopped, I might break. I didn't cry. Not then. There's a kind of clarity that comes when the last thread finally snaps. It's not loud. It's not chaotic. It's quiet. Final. By 9 a.m., Jennifer had already posted on Instagram. Pink balloons, gold streamers, a perfectly staged room at the country club. The caption read, "So grateful to have the whole family here." The whole family. 3 hours before the event even started. I looked at it once, then I set my phone down and didn't pick it up again. By 2:15 p.m. I was standing at the garden venue in Mystic. It sat behind a small inn overlooking a salt marsh, where the water turned silver in the afternoon light. The kind of place that feels untouched, like it exists slightly outside the noise of everything else. Daniel had built the arch himself. Salvaged oak, sanded smooth, wrapped with eucalyptus and simple white ribbon. It wasn't perfect in a polished way. It was perfect in an honest one. 42 white chairs were set in neat rows across the grass. Each one had a small sprig of lavender tied to the back with twine. From a distance, it looked beautiful, like a painting. Up close, the truth was harder to ignore. Most of them were empty. 7 people. That's who came. Daniel, already waiting at the end of the aisle. Melissa, who had flown in without hesitation. 2 of Daniel's friends from art school, Brian and Karen. 2 of my college friends who drove up from New York that morning. And George, standing there in a navy suit I had never seen him wear before, looking slightly out of place and completely steady at the same time. 7 people in 42 chairs. The wind moved through the empty rows, brushing against the lavender, making a soft, rustling sound that filled the spaces where voices should have been. I stood at the start of the aisle, holding my bouquet, my dress catching lightly against my legs. No one stood beside me. No father. No family. Just the awareness of every empty seat pressing in from all sides. The music started just a violin and cello from 2 local college students. Pachelbel's canon, soft and familiar, floating out across the marsh. Melissa stepped toward me. "I can walk you down," she whispered. I shook my head. "You're my maid of honor, you belong up there." I looked down the aisle. Daniel was watching me, his eyes already red, his hands clenched together like he was holding himself steady. I was about to take the first step alone, then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, measured, certain. I believe I'm overdressed for a garden party. I turned. George stood a few feet behind me, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. Navy 3-piece suit, clean lines, a pale blue pocket square tucked neatly in place. He looked different. Not like the man who wandered downstairs with a chipped coffee mug and quiet suggestions about lighting. But the steadiness in his eyes was the same. He extended his arm. But if you'd allow an old man the honor? Something shifted in my chest. Not sharp, not painful. Just opening. "George, you don't have to." "I know," he said gently. "I want to." Then, after a beat, "Your father should be here. But since he isn't, someone who values you should." I didn't hesitate again. I placed my hand on his arm, and we walked. The 7 people who had come stood as we passed. Melissa was already crying, Brian and Karen smiling through it, my friends holding their hands over their mouths. Daniel didn't move. He just watched me come toward him like this was the only thing that mattered. And in that moment, it was. The ceremony lasted maybe 12 minutes. Our officiant, a retired judge Daniel knew, kept it simple. No speeches, no performances, just vows. Daniel had written his on a piece of canvas, primed in white. I'd written mine on the back of one of my illustrations. We both cried. We both laughed. 7 people clapped. And somehow, it was enough. More than enough. Because for the first time that day, I stopped counting who wasn't there. And started seeing who was. And for a few hours, that was enough. We stayed in the garden after the ceremony, letting the afternoon stretch out without trying to turn it into something bigger than it was. There was no grand reception waiting for us. No ballroom or band or perfectly timed speeches. We ordered pizza from a small place in downtown Mystic, paper boxes stacked on a folding table, grease spots soaking through the cardboard. Melissa opened a couple bottles of wine she'd brought in her carry-on. Brian found a playlist on his phone and connected it to a portable speaker. We danced on the grass. No choreography, no spotlight, just music drifting into the evening air while the sun dipped low over the marsh. Fireflies started to appear just after sunset, blinking in and out like quiet applause. At one point, I caught Daniel watching me, not in a way that asked for anything, not in a way that needed approval, just present. That kind of presence is rare. I held on to it. By the time the music faded and the last of the plates were cleared, the air had cooled, the kind of cool that settles in after a long day, when everything finally slows down enough for you to feel what's been waiting underneath. Daniel was helping Brian fold up tables. Melissa was stacking empty cups. George stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, looking out over the water like he was giving us space without ever really leaving. I sat down in one of the white chairs, one of the 35 that had been empty. For the first time all day, I reached for my phone. I don't know what I expected. Not apologies, exactly. I think I just expected acknowledgement, a message, a sentence, something that proved I hadn't imagined the entire day. The screen lit up. Nothing. No missed calls, no texts, no, "we're sorry we couldn't make it." Not even a simple, "congratulations." 0. I stared at it longer than I needed to, like if I waited a few more seconds, something might appear. Like the silence was just delayed. It wasn't. There's a specific kind of hurt that comes from being excluded, but there's a deeper one that comes from being ignored. As if the event itself didn't happen. As if you didn't happen. I opened Instagram before I could stop myself. I told myself I wouldn't, that it didn't matter. But there are habits you don't break in a single day. Jennifer had posted 14 photos. 14. The country club looked exactly how I imagined: pink and gold decorations, a dessert table that probably cost more than our entire wedding, waitstaff in pressed uniforms moving quietly in the background. I recognized every face. My mother, smiling with a glass of champagne. My Aunt Susan leaning in, laughing. Cousins I had grown up with, standing shoulder to shoulder like nothing had been missing that day. And my father, standing next to Jennifer, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, smiling. The last photo was a group shot, Jennifer in the center, glowing. Everyone gathered around her, close, connected, complete. The caption read, "Surrounded by love. Family is everything." I read it once, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. That was the narrative. That was the version of the day they chose to record. And in that version, there was no empty garden, no row of chairs with no one in them, no daughter walking down an aisle without her father. Just love. I zoomed in on one of the photos without really thinking about why. A background shot near the bar. People talking, glasses raised, the kind of moment that looks effortless from the outside. Scott was in the corner, turned slightly away from the camera, phone pressed to his ear. His expression didn't match the room. Tight. Distracted. Something underneath the surface that didn't belong at a celebration. I noticed it. Then I let it go. Because at that point, I had already seen enough. That night, back in the studio, the quiet felt different. Not heavy. Just clear. Daniel and I lay on the futon, the windows open, the sound of crickets filling the room. The lavender we'd taken from the chairs sat in jars along the windowsill, the scent soft and grounding. "I married the right person," he said, staring at the ceiling. I turned my head toward him. "In a garden with 7 people," he added. I let out a small breath. Almost a laugh. "You deserved more," I said quietly. "A real wedding. A full room." He turned then, finally looking at me. "This was real," he said. "George was there. Melissa was there. The people who showed up. They showed up." He paused. "That's more than most people get." I didn't argue, because I knew he was right. But knowing something, and feeling it, those are 2 different things. I pressed my face into his shoulder and finally let myself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to release what I had been holding all day. And somewhere in that quiet, between the sound of crickets and the faint scent of lavender, something shifted again. Not in the world around me. In me. I stopped waiting for something that wasn't coming. And once I did that, the space it left behind filled faster than I expected. Not with noise, not with distractions, with truth. The first week after the wedding passed quietly. No calls, no messages. Not even the kind of polite check-in people send when they don't know what else to say. It was as if June 14th had been erased from my family's calendar completely. I let it stay that way. Daniel went back to work almost immediately. Not out of obligation, out of instinct. Painting was how he processed everything. It always had been. I'd seen him work through frustration, through doubt, through the slow, steady pressure of building something without guarantees. But this felt different. He started a new series. Large canvases. Bigger than anything he'd done before. He called it the 7th chair. At first, he didn't explain it. He didn't need to. I could see it. A dining table set for 8. One chair slightly pulled back, untouched. A church pew with space carved into it by absence. A row of white chairs in a garden, lavender tied to each one, most of them empty. He wasn't painting anger. He was painting absence. And somehow, that felt heavier. One afternoon, George came downstairs like he always did, quiet, unannounced, a chipped mug of black coffee in his hand. He stood in front of the largest canvas, the one with the garden, for a long time without saying anything. Then he stepped closer. "The light here," he said, pointing to the edge of an empty chair. "Push it warmer, just a fraction." Daniel adjusted it. The painting shifted instantly. Not dramatically, subtly, but enough that you could feel it. George nodded once. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He pulled out his phone. Didn't explain, didn't ask permission. Just took a photo of the painting and typed something quickly. I didn't think much of it at the time. To me, George was still just George, the quiet landlord upstairs who charged us $800 a month for a space that should have cost twice that. The man who brought tomatoes from his garden in August and never made a big deal out of anything. I didn't realize I was standing in the middle of something much bigger. 2 weeks after the wedding, George knocked on our door. Not the usual tap and enter. A real knock. "Come upstairs," he said when I opened it. "Both of you." There was something in his tone that made me pause. Not urgent, not dramatic, just deliberate. His kitchen looked the same as always, small, clean, functional. But the table had been cleared except for 3 mugs and a cardboard box sitting in the center. "Sit," he said. Daniel and I exchanged a glance, then did. George opened the box. Inside were catalogs. Thick, glossy exhibition catalogs. The kind you see in galleries in New York. Names I recognized without fully understanding why artists whose work I'd seen in books, in articles, in places that felt far removed from our life in New Haven. "Whitmore Fine Art," I read quietly from one of the covers. George nodded. "I ran it for 22 years. I looked up at him. "You, what?" "I represented 43 artists during that time," he continued, like he was explaining something routine. 7 of them are in the Whitney's permanent collection. The room felt suddenly smaller. I looked at Daniel. He hadn't moved. "You never told us," I said. George shrugged slightly. "You never needed to know." There was no arrogance in it. No performance. Just fact. "I wanted to be sure," he added, turning his attention to Daniel. "There's a difference between someone who's competent and someone who's extraordinary. I've spent my entire career learning how to tell the difference." A pause. "You're extraordinary." Daniel didn't respond. He rarely did when something mattered that much. Then George said the part that changed everything. 6 months ago, I sent photographs of your work to someone. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Charles Ashford. Even I knew that name. If you followed art even casually, you knew it. A private collector with one of the most significant contemporary collections in the country. The kind of name that appeared in museum circles, auction houses, headlines. "He bought one piece immediately," George said. $85,000. I turned to Daniel. He was looking at the table. "I was going to tell you after the wedding," he said quietly. I didn't want it to become about money. For a second, I didn't know what to say. $85,000. For one painting. That was more than my father made in a year at the bank, George continued. That wasn't the end of it. Of course it wasn't. Over the next few days, everything unfolded with a kind of precision that made it impossible to dismiss as luck. Charles Ashford's attorney contacted Daniel with a formal contract. 12 original paintings, 18 months. Total value, $450,000. Structured payments, legal protections, insurance, gallery coordination. It wasn't a handshake agreement. It was real, binding, documented. Attached to it was an invitation from Harrington Gallery NYC in Manhattan. A solo exhibition. A full show centered around the seventh chair. I sat at George's kitchen table, reading through the documents. My hands steady, but my mind trying to catch up. This was the same man my father had asked when he was going to get a real job. The same man my family had dismissed without a second thought. Daniel signed the contract 3 days later. We drove to New York for the meeting. Park Avenue. Leather chairs. An attorney who spoke in measured tones and used words like portfolio strategy and long-term positioning. I watched Daniel sign his name. Calm. Certain. Like he had always known this was where he was going. On the drive back to New Haven, I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city faded behind us. "This is more than my dad made in 5 years," I said finally. Daniel glanced at me briefly. "It's not about that," I nodded. "I know. But I also knew something else. For years, my family had measured worth in a very specific way. Income, status, security. And now, without them even knowing it, the man they had dismissed met every one of those standards. He just hadn't needed their approval to get there. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt clarifying, like a quiet shift in the ground beneath everything I had believed about where I stood. When we got back to the studio, the space looked the same. Paint-stained counters, canvases stacked against the walls, the same worn futon by the window. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. Daniel picked up a brush and went back to the canvas like he always did. No celebration, no announcement, no need to prove anything to anyone. I stood there for a moment, watching him. And for the first time, I understood something with complete certainty. We hadn't been behind. We had just been building something no one else knew how to recognize yet. And the strange thing about that kind of truth is, it doesn't stay hidden forever. It catches up. About a week after Daniel signed the contract, his phone rang while he was in the studio, hands covered in paint. He put it on speaker without thinking. "Daniel," a calm voice said, unhurried, controlled. "This is Charles Ashford." Even through a speaker, you could hear the difference. The kind of voice that doesn't rush because it never has to. "I understand you and your wife didn't get much of a honeymoon," Charles continued. "My yacht, the Meridian, will be in Monaco next month. I'd like you both to spend 10 days on board. Consider it a thank you for the first 3 paintings." I remember looking at Daniel, then looking at the canvas, then back at him again. We both knew what this was. Not charity. Access. The kind of door that doesn't open twice. "Are we allowed to say yes to that?" I whispered, covering the phone. Daniel didn't hesitate. "George said this is how he works. It's professional." I thought about June 14th. 42 chairs. 7 people. A father who chose not to show up. And I realized something in that moment that felt both simple and overdue. I had spent most of my life making myself smaller so other people could stay comfortable. I wasn't doing that anymore. "Tell him yes," I said. Daniel smiled slightly. "Yes," he said into the phone. "We'd be honored." We flew to Nice on a Tuesday morning in July. I'd never been to Europe before. Never had a reason to. The kind of travel my family valued was different resorts, status, places that could be explained in a single sentence to the right audience. This felt quieter, different. When we boarded the Meridian, I understood immediately that this wasn't just a boat. It was a world, 180 feet of polished wood, glass, and quiet precision. Staff who moved like they had rehearsed it. A cabin with a private balcony overlooking water so blue it didn't look real. Marble floors. Fresh gardenias placed on the nightstand like someone had anticipated exactly what the room needed before we even arrived. The first morning, I stood barefoot on the deck, wearing a simple linen dress I'd bought for $40 at a market in Nice, and watched the coastline drift past. No noise, no expectations. Just space. On the third night, Charles hosted a dinner. 8 guests, 2 collectors from London, a curator from the Tate, an art critic from Berlin. People who spoke in references I didn't fully understand but somehow still followed. Daniel sat beside me. Quiet, like always, but not small. Charles stood at the head of the table and raised his glass. "I'd like to introduce Daniel Carter," he said. "The most compelling realist painter I've encountered in the last 20 years. The table went still. Not awkward. Attentive. Daniel explained the 7th chair in a few sentences. No performance. No exaggeration. Paintings about absence, he said. About the spaces people leave behind when they choose not to show up. No one asked what he meant. They understood. I sat beside him, my hand resting lightly against his leg under the table. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being overlooked. We both belonged there. On our last night, I did something I almost never do. I posted. Not for attention, not for validation, for record. The photo was simple. Daniel standing behind me at the bow, his arms around me, the Monaco coastline soft in the distance, a glass of champagne on the table beside us, and just barely visible, the Harrington Gallery NYC catalog with his name printed on the cover. I wrote one sentence, honeymoon with my husband. Grateful for the people who showed up. No tags. No explanation. No story. I posted it at 9 p.m., local time. Then I put my phone in the drawer and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I reached for it without thinking. The screen lit up, and for a second, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Notifications. Scrolling. More than I could process at once. I unlocked it. 417. Missed calls. Text messages. Voicemails. 417. I sat on the edge of the bed and just stared. The same people who couldn't send one message on my wedding day suddenly had a lot to say. My father. 23 missed calls. Claire, whose yacht is that? Call me back. I didn't realize Daniel was doing this well. Honey, please call your dad. My mother. 18 call. Oh my God, are you in Monaco? Is that safe? We need to celebrate when you get back. Celebrate. The word landed differently now. Jennifer. 7 calls. Wait, what? Is Daniel actually selling his art? We should talk. Of course we should. Now that it mattered. Messages from aunts, cousins, people I hadn't heard from in years. So proud of you. We always knew he was talented. Congratulations. Always knew. That part almost made me laugh. And then, at the bottom of the screen, Scott. He had never texted me directly in 5 years. Is your husband represented by a gallery? I have clients who might be interested. I read that one twice. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did. I scrolled through every message, one by one, slowly, like reading something clinical, detached. By the time I reached the end, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt clear. Daniel stepped out onto the balcony a few minutes later. He didn't ask what the messages said. He didn't need to. I'm not going to ignore them forever, I said. He nodded. But I'm also not going to pretend this is okay. He nodded again. That was the thing about Daniel. He never needed to fix anything. He just stood beside me while I decided who I was going to be. I looked down at the phone one more time. 417 messages. Not one of them had come when it mattered. I locked the screen and set it back in the drawer. For a while, I just sat there on the edge of the bed, listening to the soft movement of water against the hull. The room was quiet. Too quiet for the kind of noise that had just flooded into my life. 417 messages. Not one of them had come when I was standing at the end of an aisle with no one beside me. That was the part I couldn't ignore. It would have been easy to answer. To call my father back. To let my mother fill the silence with questions that sounded like concern but arrived too late to mean what they were pretending to mean. It would have been easy to slip back into the version of myself they were used to. The one who smooths things over. The one who doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. But something in me had already shifted. Quietly. Permanently. I wasn't angry. That's what surprised me the most. I expected anger. I expected something sharp. Something reactive. What I felt instead was clarity. The kind that doesn't raise its voice. The kind that just stands. I picked the phone back up later that afternoon. Not because I felt pressure to respond. Because I wanted to be deliberate about what came next. I opened the family group chat for the first time since I'd muted it weeks earlier. The messages were already there. Fragments of concern. Curiosity dressed as excitement. Claire, is that really you? Where are you staying? We didn't know Daniel was doing so well. We're so proud of you. Proud. That word again. It's interesting how quickly people become proud of something they once dismissed. I didn't scroll all the way up. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was there. Silence where there should have been support. Absence where there should have been presence. I started typing. Stopped. Deleted it. Then typed again. Not emotional. Not defensive. Just accurate. Thank you for your messages. Daniel and I are doing well. For those asking, Daniel signed a major art commission several weeks ago. The yacht belongs to his collector. Our trip was a gift. I paused. Then I added the part that mattered. I won't pretend your absence on June 14th didn't hurt. It did. My father promised to walk me down the aisle and chose not to. My mother chose a baby shower over her daughter's wedding. My sister scheduled her event on the same day. I read it once. No anger, no exaggeration. Just truth. I'm not angry, I continued. But I do need space. When I'm ready to talk, I'll reach out. I ask that you respect that. I pressed send, and for the first time in my life, I didn't wait for a response. I put the phone down and walked out onto the deck. The sun was lower now, stretching across the water in long, quiet lines. Daniel was already there, leaning against the railing, sketchbook in hand. He didn't look up when I stepped beside him. Done? He asked. Yes, that was enough. We stood there for a while without speaking. And for the first time since June 14th, I felt something settle into place. Not closure. Something better. Ownership. The responses didn't come right away. Not because they didn't see the message. Because they didn't know how to respond to it. I imagine them reading it in pieces, passing phones across kitchen counters, sitting in rooms where the truth had finally arrived without permission. My father called that night. I didn't answer. My mother texted, "Claire, please don't do this. We love you." Love. Another word that sounds different depending on when it shows up. Jennifer didn't respond in the group chat at all. She posted instead. An Instagram story. A photo of a dinner table. Warm lighting. Wine glasses. Everything arranged just right. The caption read, "Family dinner tonight. Missing one." I looked at it for a long time. Not because it hurt. Because it was familiar. That need to rewrite the narrative. To shift the story just enough so it didn't reflect what actually happened. In her version, I was the one who stepped away, not the one who was left. I didn't respond to that either, because the truth didn't need defending anymore. It had already been said, and the people who mattered had already heard it. The truth didn't need defending anymore. It had already been said. And once you say something like that clearly, without anger, without apology, you don't get to go back to who you were before. That was the part I understood the moment I put my phone down. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about changing the terms of the relationship. When we got back from Monaco, the silence returned, but it felt different this time. Not empty, not uncertain, intentional. My mother called 2 days after we landed. I let it ring, not out of spite, not to prove a point, because I wasn't ready to hear her explain something I already understood. She left a voicemail. "Claire, sweetheart, I don't like how things feel right now. We should talk. We don't do this." I listened to it once. Then, I deleted it. Because what she meant was, families don't create distance. What I had learned was, families don't ignore you when it matters and expect things to stay the same afterward. There's a difference. A few days later, she texted again. "Your father is really upset. He saw the photo. He just wants to understand." Understand. That word kept coming up, like understanding was something that had been unavailable to them before this moment, like it required a yacht. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally cared enough about myself not to rush back into something that had never been fair to begin with. Daniel never told me what to do. That's one of the reasons I trusted him from the beginning. He didn't manage my emotions. He didn't try to fix anything. He just paid attention. One night, about a week after we got back, we were sitting on the futon in the studio. The windows were open, late summer air moving through the room, carrying that soft, steady hum of cicadas. My phone lit up again. I didn't pick it up. Daniel glanced at it, then at me. "You don't owe anyone a quick response," he said. I nodded. I know. But hearing it out loud mattered, because for most of my life, I had believed the opposite. That love meant immediacy. That being a good daughter meant being available, accommodating, understanding even when no one was offering that back. That belief had shaped everything. And now, it didn't. "I'm not cutting them off," I said after a while. "I know you're not," Daniel replied. I can't go back to how it was." He set his sketchbook aside. "You're not supposed to." It was simple. So simple it almost felt obvious. But it wasn't. Because changing a relationship doesn't start with a conversation. It starts with a boundary. And boundaries aren't loud. They don't need to be announced over and over again. They show up in what you don't do, in what you don't accept, in the space you choose to keep. A few days later, I sent one more message. Not long, not complicated. I'm not ready to talk yet. When I am, I'll reach out. I need time, and I need that to be respected. I read it once, then sent it. And again. I didn't wait, because the point wasn't how they responded. The point was that I had finally said what I needed. Clearly, without softening it, without explaining it away. For the first time, I wasn't trying to make it easier for them to hear. I was just telling the truth, and then I did something that felt unfamiliar at first. I went back to my life, my work, the quiet, steady rhythm Daniel and I had built long before anyone else started paying attention. Because that was the part no one ever saw. The part that didn't change depending on who was watching. And for the first time, that was enough. But life has a way of continuing forward, whether you're ready for the next chapter or not. Daniel kept painting. That part never changed. What changed was the scale. The studio in New Haven started to feel smaller not because it had shrunk, but because what he was creating inside it had grown beyond the walls. The canvases were larger now, 36 by 48 inches, some even bigger. He worked longer hours, but not with urgency. With focus. There's a difference. George came down almost every afternoon, the same way he always had, quiet, observant, coffee in hand. But now, when he stood in front of a painting, he didn't just study it. He evaluated it, not critically, professionally. One evening, he stood in front of the garden piece, the one that had started it all, and nodded to himself. "It's ready," he said. Daniel didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. 2 weeks later, Harrington Gallery NYC sent over the final exhibition plan. The 7th chair. 12 paintings. Opening night. Thursday, 6 p.m. Chelsea, New York. I remember holding the printed email in my hands, reading it once, then again, like the words might rearrange themselves into something smaller. They didn't. This wasn't a small showing. It was a full exhibition. A statement. The kind of opportunity artists wait decades for if it ever comes at all. Daniel treated it the same way he treated everything else. He went back to the canvas. Opening night arrived without ceremony. I wore a simple black dress. Nothing expensive. Nothing that asked for attention. Daniel wore a charcoal jacket he'd owned for years, pressed just enough to feel intentional. We drove into the city that afternoon, the kind of quiet ride where neither of you needs to fill the space with words. Harrington Gallery NYC sat on West 25th Street, surrounded by glass storefronts and polished concrete sidewalks, the kind of place where people walk in already expecting to be impressed. By 6 p.m., the room was full. 200 people, maybe more. Collectors, curators, critics, people who spoke in quiet tones and didn't look around for approval before forming an opinion. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking it in. White walls, soft lighting, and along those walls, our story, not told, shown. The first painting I saw was the dining table, 8 place settings. Silverware aligned, glasses untouched, one chair slightly pulled back, empty. Further down, the church pew, a folded program resting at one end, space carved into the wood beside it. And then, the garden, 42 white chairs, lavender tied to each one, 7 of them occupied. 35 of them not. The arch Daniel had built, rendered in oil with a precision that made it feel like you could step through it. The light caught the empty seats in a way that made them impossible to ignore. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was exact. I watched people as they moved through the room. They didn't rush. They stopped. They leaned in. Some of them stood in front of the garden piece longer than the others, not speaking, just absorbing. A woman near the center wiped her eyes without trying to hide it. A man beside her shook his head slowly, like he was recognizing something he hadn't expected to feel. Daniel stood a few feet away, answering questions when they came, but never inserting himself into the moment. He didn't need to explain the work. The work explained itself. A reporter from the New York Times approached him about halfway through the evening. I was close enough to hear. "The title," she said, glancing toward the garden painting. "June 14th. Is it autobiographical?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes." No elaboration. No attempt to soften it. 7 guests, he added. 42 chairs. The reporter nodded once. That was all she needed, because the rest was already on the walls. The article ran the following Sunday. Full feature. Arts section. There was a photograph of Daniel standing beside the garden painting, his hand resting lightly against the frame. The headline mentioned absence, emotional displacement, precision. It used the word extraordinary. It also mentioned the numbers 7, 4 to 2. It didn't name my family. It didn't need to. The story was clear without them. That was the part I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't revenge. There was no confrontation, no public accusation, no dramatic reveal, just truth, placed in a room where people were willing to see it. And once it was seen, it couldn't be unseen. My phone rang that afternoon. I knew who it was before I looked. My mother. I let it ring once, twice. Then I answered. "Claire," she said, her voice unsteady in a way I hadn't heard before. "Your father saw the article." I didn't respond. "He hasn't said much," she continued. "He just keeps looking at it." I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of frustration, out of recognition. "He's upset," she added. I exhaled slowly. "Mom," I said, "Daniel didn't create anything that wasn't already there." There was silence on the other end, because there wasn't anything she could argue with. The painting didn't exaggerate. It didn't accuse. It didn't reinterpret. It remembered. And now, so did they. Later that evening, I stood alone in the gallery for a few minutes after most of the crowd had cleared out. The room felt different without the voices. Quieter. More honest. I walked over to the garden painting one more time. 42 chairs. 7 filled. 35 empty. For a long time, I had thought those empty chairs defined the story. The absence. The loss. But standing there now, I saw something else. The 7 that weren't empty. The ones who showed up. The ones who stayed. The ones who had always been enough. And for the first time, I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. I felt like something had been made clear. And once something becomes clear, it doesn't go back to being invisible. For a while, nothing happened. At least, nothing I could see. Life settled into a rhythm again. Daniel painted. I worked at the small table by the window, sketching illustrations, answering emails, building something steady in a way that didn't need to be announced to anyone. George came by on Sundays with a bottle of wine and quiet observations that always seemed to land exactly where they were needed. The noise had faded. The distance held. And then, slowly, things started to shift. Not in my life. In theirs, I didn't hear it all at once. It came in fragments, the way news does when it isn't meant to reach you directly. A message from Aunt Susan. Casual in tone but pointed in content. "Have you talked to your parents lately?" I hadn't. "Why?" I asked. There was a pause before she responded. "Scott's company is having some issues." Issues. That word again. Soft. Non-committal. The kind of word people use when they're not ready to say what something actually is. I didn't press. But over the next week, the details filled themselves in. 2 major development projects in Stamford had fallen through. Financing collapsed. Loans that were supposed to carry the projects forward were pulled back. Investors stepped away. Parker Properties wasn't expanding anymore. It was contracting. Then came the official part. A notice filed with the Connecticut Business Registry. Chapter 11. I read it once, then closed the page. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I did. The kind of stability my family had built their entire identity around, the kind that came with Scott's name, his money. His certainty wasn't as permanent as they had believed. And when something like that shifts, everything attached to it shifts too. The calls started again a few days later. Not the same as before. Quieter. Less confident. My mother first. "Hi, honey," she said, her voice carrying that careful brightness I had learned to recognize. "I was just thinking about you." I leaned against the counter, phone in hand. "I'm okay, Mom. I'm glad," she said quickly. We've had a lot going on here." I waited. She didn't say it directly. She never did. "Your father's been under some stress," she added. "You know how things are." I did. Or at least, I knew what she wasn't saying. Scott had stopped covering the mortgage. $3,200 a month. Gone. The credit card my mother used for groceries, for clothes, for the small comforts she had come to rely on. Cancelled. The kitchen renovation, the lifestyle, the quiet sense of security they had built around someone else's success. It wasn't theirs anymore. It never had been. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. And I meant it. But I didn't offer anything more. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The kind that waits for something. An opening. An offer. When it didn't come, she shifted. "Well, maybe you and Daniel could come for dinner this weekend," she said. "Your father would really like that." I looked out the window. The late afternoon light settled across the studio floor, catching the edge of a canvas Daniel had left to dry. "I'm busy, Mom." Another pause. "Okay," she said softly. "Well, your father says hi. I'll talk to you later." I ended the call. Not abruptly, not coldly, just clearly, because for the first time, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. When Scott's money was steady, I didn't exist. Now that it wasn't, I was suddenly visible again. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. A few days later, Jennifer called. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Claire," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, less polished. "I've been meaning to call you." I didn't respond right away. "I miss you," she added. That word miss landed differently than the others. Less practiced, but not entirely clean. "How are you?" I asked. There was a brief hesitation. "We're figuring things out," she said. "Scott's been under a lot of pressure." Of course he had. For the first time in years, pressure wasn't something he could solve with a check. "Mom and Dad are struggling," she continued. "And I thought maybe we could all come together. Move past everything. Like it was a disagreement. Like it had been temporary." I leaned against the wall, letting her words settle. "You mean the part where you scheduled your shower on my wedding day?" I asked calmly. Silence. "Or the part where you called everyone and told them to choose you?" Still silence. "I was pregnant," she said finally. I was overwhelmed. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I believe you," I said. And I did. But that didn't change what had happened. "What do you want, Jennifer?" I asked. There it was. The question underneath everything else. Another pause. Longer this time. "I want us to be a family again," she said. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because that was the part that mattered. Not the money. Not the situation. The assumption. That family could be paused, and then resumed when it was convenient. "I love you," I said quietly. And I meant that too. But I'm not going to pretend nothing happened just because things are difficult now. Her breathing shifted slightly. "I'm not asking you to pretend," she said. "Yes, you are," I replied gently. "You're just using different words." The line went quiet. And for the first time, I didn't rush to fill it. Because I wasn't the one trying to fix something anymore. I was just the one finally seeing it clearly. And once you see something clearly, the next step isn't always confrontation. Sometimes, it's waiting to see who's willing to meet you there. A few weeks passed after that call with Jennifer. No dramatic follow-up, no sudden reconciliation, just distance. The kind that gives people room to decide whether they're going to stay where they've always been, or move. I didn't expect anything to change quickly. People don't shift that fast. Not when it costs them something. Not when it requires them to look at themselves honestly. That's why, when my father showed up unannounced one afternoon, I almost didn't recognize what I was looking at. I heard the tires on the gravel first. A car pulling up slowly. Like the driver wasn't entirely sure he should be there. I stepped out onto the porch. And there he was. Standing beside the car, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly rounded in a way I had never seen before. He looked older. Not in years. In weight. "Hi," he said. Just that. No speech. No explanation. I opened the screen door. "Hi, Dad." There was a moment where neither of us moved. Then he walked up the steps. "I didn't come to ask for anything," he said. I nodded. I figured. That seemed to settle something in him. "I came to say something," he added. We stood there on the porch, the late afternoon sun cutting across the yard, quiet in that steady, familiar way that doesn't rush you into words. He took a breath. "I was sitting in a country club eating finger sandwiches," he said slowly, "while my daughter got married with 7 people. He didn't look at me when he said it. "I keep thinking about that," he continued, "over and over." I stayed quiet, because this wasn't something I needed to interrupt. "I told myself it wasn't a big deal," he said. "That we'd make it up later, that there would be other moments." A pause. "There aren't." Now he looked at me, and for the first time, there was no defense in his expression. No explanation waiting behind his words. Just recognition. "I will carry that for the rest of my life," he said. There it was. Not polished. Not perfect, but real. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Acknowledgement. I know, I said quietly. We stood there for another second. Then I stepped aside. You can come in, I added. Daniel just made coffee. He nodded once and walked inside. He moved slowly through the house, not inspecting it, taking it in. The small kitchen, the worn table, the stack of sketchbooks near the window, Daniel's paintings leaning against the walls, some finished, some still in progress. None of it looked like the life my parents had once valued. And yet, there was something in the way he looked at it now. Different. He stopped in the hallway. A small painting hung near the coat hooks. An early study of the garden. 7 chairs filled. 35 empty. He stood in front of it longer than I expected. Then he reached into the bag he had brought with him. Pulled something out. A frame. Inside it was a certificate. The Connecticut Statewide Art Award. I read softly. My name. 12 years ago. I had forgotten about it. I found it in the attic, he said. Your mother had it in a box. I didn't say anything. It should have been on the wall, he added. I took it from him, ran my fingers along the edge of the frame. There are apologies that come in words. And then there are the ones that come in what people choose to bring back. This was both. We sat at the table with coffee. Daniel joined us, quiet but present, the way he always was. No tension, no performance, just 3 people in a room, letting something real settle into place. I don't expect you to fix anything, my father said after a while. I nodded. Good, I replied. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I figured you'd say that. A pause. I needed you to know I see it now, he added. That word again. See. But this time, it didn't feel delayed. It felt earned. I'm not going back to how things were, I said. I know, he replied. And I believed him, because for the first time, he wasn't trying to negotiate. He was listening. A few days later, Jennifer sent a letter. Not a text. Not a call. A letter. Handwritten. I sat at the table and opened it slowly, unfolding the paper carefully like it might fall apart if I moved too quickly. It wasn't perfect. It didn't explain everything. It didn't fix anything. But it contained one sentence I hadn't expected to see. I scheduled the shower on your wedding day. No justification. No excuse. Just ownership. I read that line twice. Then a third time. Because sometimes, the simplest sentence is the hardest one to write. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. Not thrown away. Not displayed. Just kept. Because forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a process. One you don't rush. One you don't force. One you allow to unfold at the same pace as the truth that made it necessary in the first place. And for the first time, I felt like that process had actually begun, not finished, not resolved in some clean, satisfying way, just begun. 6 months later, I was standing barefoot on the back porch of a house that belonged to me, not rented, not borrowed, not tied to anyone else's name or approval. Mine. It wasn't large, about 1,400 square feet, 2 bedrooms, white clapboard siding, blue shutters, a porch that wrapped just far enough around the side to catch the afternoon light, 10 minutes from the water, close enough to hear it when the wind shifted in the right direction. Daniel had turned the downstairs into a proper studio. North-facing windows, good ventilation, space to move without bumping into half-finished canvases, the kind of space that didn't interrupt the work. We paid for it ourselves, every inch of it. No help, no leverage, no quiet obligations attached to the deed, just ours. Inside, my sketches were spread across the dining table. A children's book I had been working on for weeks, watercolor illustrations of a girl planting wildflowers in a place no one thought anything could grow. It felt familiar, not because of the story, because of the truth underneath it. Daniel was downstairs, the soft scrape of his palette knife carrying through the open window. That sound had become part of the rhythm of my life, steady, unforced, always moving forward. George came by every Sunday. He'd pull into the driveway in that same old Volvo, step out with a bottle of wine, never expensive, always good, and sit at our table like he had always belonged there. Because in every way that mattered, he did. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the light settled across the yard, I set the table for dinner. 7 chairs, not because I needed more, because I finally understood what mattered. The people who showed up, the ones who stayed, The ones who didn't need an invitation twice. My mother called once a week now, not asking for anything. Just checking in. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. And sometimes, different is where healing starts. My father came by occasionally. Not often. Not trying to rebuild everything at once. Just enough. Just real. Jennifer and I spoke less. But when we did, it wasn't layered with performance. There was space now. And in that space, honesty had somewhere to exist. People always ask if I forgave them. I think they expect a simple answer. Yes. No. Something that fits neatly into a sentence. But forgiveness doesn't work that way. It's not a decision you make once. It's something you choose, over and over again. Some days it feels close. Some days it doesn't. And both are part of it. I don't measure my life by what was missing anymore. Not by the empty chairs. Not by the silence. I measure it by what remained. What stayed. What proved itself without needing to be asked. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the people who left. The ones who didn't. I used to think strength looked like holding everything together. Now I know better. Strength is knowing when to stop carrying what was never yours to begin with. You don't have to prove your worth. You don't have to argue your place. You don't have to stay where you're only tolerated. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is step back, build something real, and let the truth reveal itself in its own time, quietly, clearly, without asking for permission. Real life has a way of revealing what people truly value, especially when money, status, or convenience are involved. This story is a reminder that respect is not proven by words, but by who shows up when it matters. Sometimes, the people we expect to stand beside us don't. And when that happens, the lesson isn't to chase their approval, it's to recognize it was never ours to earn. Build your life around those who choose you without conditions. Set boundaries without guilt. Because in the end, peace doesn't come from being accepted by everyone. It comes from knowing your worth and living in alignment with it.